Hi, everybody. This is Ann Patchett at Parnassus Books. Thank you for listening to Parnassus Presents. Your support allows us to keep bringing you fantastic events. So please consider purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book at the link below. We hope you enjoy the event, recorded live from the Parnassus stage.
Alice, and I'm the director of events here at Parnassus Books. And on behalf of Ann Patchett and all of us working here, I just want to say thanks so much for being here, and thank you for shopping local and supporting us. And it's because you come here that we can have these fabulous events like we have tonight. And I see some of you. Actually, I'm holding my phone. I'm going to put it down, but this is to remind myself as well as all of you to turn off your phones. So that would be great. Now I want to hold up 33 Place Brugmann, which is such an amazing book, and we are absolutely thrilled to have Alice Austen here with us tonight. So tonight, Alice is an award-winning playwright, screenwriter, producer, and this is her debut novel, 33 Place Brugmann. And she is in conversation tonight with our own wonderful Lindsay Lynch. And Lindsay, of course, is an author also of Do Tell, and she is our book buyer here at Parnassus, and I'm really absolutely thrilled to just have them both. So help me welcome Alice Austen and Lindsay Lynch.
Elise tried to steal my notes, and the last time I didn't have my notes, I just started talking about reality TV, and I don't think that's what anybody signed up for.
We could talk about reality TV, I assure you.
Yeah, surprise, we're going to hear what I watched on Bravo last night. Thank you so much for being here.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you, all the lovely people at Parnassus, and Anne, I've had a delightful day. I've gotten my signature back in order, which is great.
We watched it go through some little variations.
But
it
was
honestly,
the Austen. I was like, oh no.
It's okay. I was saying when I've signed over 1,000 books, my name changes from Lindsay Lynch to Indie Ugg. So you're doing great. Would you like to kick us off with a little short reading?
Sure. So 33 Place Brugmann is set in 1939 on the eve of the occupation in Belgium. It takes place in a Beaux-Arts building in Brussels, and it follows the residents who must confront the decision of whether to submit to the regime or resist, and each will be forced to confront who and what matters to them most. So I'll just read a little bit from the beginning. The Raphaëls leave in the middle of the night, and they leave everything behind. The sofas and chairs and beds and lamps and heavy carpets and the dining table. The films we made are in a box together with a projector, a set of oil paints, and a blank canvas. On it is a note that reads, "For Charlotte." I gasp, the air coming in tight and sharp. I might have thought I was dreaming, but for that note. When I see it, I know the Raphaëls are truly gone. In their wake, rumors swirl through the building. The Raphaëls haven't left everything. They took their silver. And the paintings? The paintings simply disappear. Brussels, Belgium, August 1939. Before. Charlotte Sauvin, 4L. The pounding on our apartment door wakes me early Saturday morning. Throwing back the covers, I jump out of bed and run down the long terrazzo hallway, but I know who it is. I can hear them. We hear every sound in this building. Through thin, rippled window glass, gaps between frames and doors, crude holes around pipes and wires, up and down the broad, echoing stone staircase, up and down the narrow, echoing elevator shaft. Every sound travels. The squeaks and groans and sighs, the thumping of taps culling water up, the flush and flow of water falling, the clank of radiators, the squawk of Dirk's saxophone, the thudding fall of stockinged footsteps, the clop of stacked leather heels on soft wood floors, the turning of keys and locks, slamming of doors, sharp click of latches, and the voices. Miss Hobert shouting at her deaf aunt through the telephone receiver, the colonel barking commands at Zipper, his hard-headed Bouvier, and Anique on the ground floor berating her husband, Mr. Everard, the notary who manages the building. So I'll stop there.
Okay, I'm going to kick us off with a real difficult one. I had to dig deep for
had a
this
feeling.
question. What is this building, and what does it mean to you?
Okay, so I lived in the building, and it is true you could hear everything. So I'll kick us off with a couple of anecdotes. So while I was in the building, my first play was produced, and my oldest son was born. And like baby Charlotte in the book, he had terrible colic. And you very quickly get to know people in a building when you have a colicky baby. So one day a woman cornered me and she said, "What's wrong with that baby?" And, I was earnestly explaining everything we were doing. And of course, with colic, nothing really helps. And she in turn was explaining precisely where their apartment was. And something clicked. Because there was a couple in the building who had very lengthy, very noisy B-movie sex. And I said to her, "We don't complain when you make noise." And mind you, this is all in hyper polite French. And she said, "We don't make noise." And I said, "Oh, I can assure you, you do." So the next day, there was a lovely note in our mailbox with a little gift congratulating us on the birth of our son. And that was the end of it. But while I was there were two elderly residents who I adored, and they loved having a baby in the building, and I think they were a little hard of hearing because they didn't seem to mind the crying. But they would have us to tea, and one of them had a remarkable private art collection. They had both lived there since before the war, and one had left during the war, and the other had stayed. And they told me the stories of what had gone on in the building, and they were so implausible, like they were almost funny. And they were heartbreaking and tragic. And they were also really suspenseful, because what became apparent to me is that people in the building knew that the others they were up to something, but they didn't know exactly what. And then you could hear everything. So there was this incredible complexity and suspense. And yes, so that's the genesis of the book.
So I would love to hear a little bit about the characters who are living in this building. If you want to give us, you don't have to give the full rundown, but
Okay.
give us some of our characters here.
So it's an eclectic group, and they are all fictional. Let me predicate it with that. But I was inspired. I lived in Belgium for quite some time, and one character who does not live in the building, who kind of makes an appearance, is no longer with us in real life, and I took certain liberties with his life because he was such a remarkable human being. His family had come to Belgium from Eastern Europe, and as a teenager, he was a fearless fighter with the Belgian resistance. And then he got to England, and he was in the OS with Graham Greene, and he had all sort of a first edition Graham Greene novels with these elliptical quotes like, "Guy, remember the drop," And the book is dedicated to Guy. And he did how he was captured and he escaped. He had a magnificent life, and he was an early architect of the European Union and Jewish, and he was a great inspiration to me. So he makes a guest appearance in the novel. But there is an architect who lives in the apartment where I lived, actually, with his daughter, who is an artist with a very particular way of looking at the world. And there is an art dealer who lives with his family, and they're Jewish. And there's a retired colonel who fought in some of the awful wars and understands what might be coming. And there is a woman who used to run a cafe in the Grand Place, and she's very nosy. And there's there's a lawyer and his wife, and they have a son who's a student. So it's an eclectic mix, and some are French and some are Belgian. I don't know. Belgium has an odd history, so it's kind of a divided country in a way. It's half Flemish and half French-speaking. And World War II is a complicated history for the Belgians, and I was interviewed recently by a Flemish novelist and journalist, and we went through a whole hour interview, and I was just like, did he like it? What did he think? And at the end, he goes, "I love the book. You got it right." And I was like, oh, phew. So,
I mean, what I love about this book is how you move between each of these characters' voices, organized through where they are in the apartment building. How did you structure this book, and how did you, go through deciding which characters you spent how much time with, or which characters you spent the most time with, when you moved between characters? How did you structure this?
That's a great question. I started with an omniscient narrator, a narrative voice, and it was sort of too bossy and all-knowing, and it really bothered me, and it didn't work. And also, it didn't capture the dramatic irony, the question of, like, what is an audience member? Because to create the suspense, if you know one character knows something, and then you're with another character knows they don't know it. This first-person series of first-person perspectives, to me, seemed right. And once I fell upon that and began to work with it, I knew it was right. And I knew also it would make it complicated in terms of, like, later down the road, because writing fiction has been my first love, and I keep having these detours. One of my partners in crime in film is sitting in the back smiling, because we have been in the trenches together in film. I think literally you were in a trench in a freezing cold cemetery trying to stay off camera, if I'm not mistaken. But whether I spent time with him, it really, there's this wonderful Cuban theater director, Maria Irina Fornes, and she told me something that I've always remembered. She was like, watch your characters, see what they do. And she really advised me to, like, watch my stage characters as though they were in silhouette before I wrote a word, which really was very helpful to me. And so I got in the shoes of these characters, and I empathized with them, because at first when I began to write it, I felt myself judging certain characters. And then I thought, no, I've got to be in their heads. And then I stopped judging them, and then what they did surprised me completely. And I stayed with characters I would never have anticipated staying with as long, and they did things that I thought, oh my gosh, well, this is not what I planned, but hey, I'm going with it. So it was a really interesting process for me.
Were there any characters who, like, the voice was just immediately there, you were in it, versus ones who it took a little bit longer to get into their voice?
Yes, there were a couple, and not characters you would necessarily expect. Like Leo, right away I was like, I got you, Leo. I'm with you.
And Leo is our art dealer, correct?
Yes, and I understood Leo. And then like Miss Aubert, I was right there. I thought, oh yes. So it was interesting to see. Some I had to, get in deeper to really feel.
Okay, on a purely, like, pragmatic level, because, like, I am so fascinated by the structure of this book and how you pulled this off. I mean, how did you work out jumping between perspectives, structuring this book? Like, I'm envisioning, like, a wall of Post-it notes.
I didn't, and I do that for films, because writing films is such a particular métier, because you have to hit certain marks especially because you get financing and people are like, well, rising action by page 50. I don't know what's happening in this movie. I read to page 10. I have no idea, so you really do have to hit your marks. And I wasn't thinking of that at all. I just let it roll. And so it was oddly one of the most structured things I've written, with the least structure at the outset.
I love that.
Yeah.
Did you have the same cast of characters start to finish? Were there any residents of the building who did not make it to the final version of this book?
First person. So I had rules about who could speak. They had to live in the building. But not everybody who lives in the building speaks. But someone from every apartment gets to speak. And I did take the liberty of cutting a floor off the building, which I'm sure I'm going to hear about next week in Brussels. I'm also like, I know people are going to come and be like, you can't hear everything. I live there. What are you talking about? Or like, they fixed the heat. It doesn't do that anymore. I'll be like,
The second floor staircase doesn't look
right.
like that.
Yeah, I know. But so yeah, there was one first-person narrative that didn't make the cut, and I kind of knew that this was going to happen, and I kept hearing it. I was like, well, let's just keep it for now. And then when it got through the agent editing process, and then Elizabeth said, and I was like, oh, okay, I agree. Well, yeah.
How was the process for you of, this being your debut novel?
I feel really blessed. So this is this has been a long haul, and I've been writing, and the nice thing is I have, a book to follow with rather quickly, I hope. I had thought that the agent I am with was the right person. And I happened to be represented at that agency for other things, but I wrote her cold and I didn't tell her because I wanted her to really respond to the material and not. And at that point I had other agent offers, so it was this miraculous thing. She was the only person, well, first of all, she said, wait, you're represented here. Why didn't you? And I'm like, I know, but I didn't want to do it that way. And then she was the one, other agents said, it's ready to go. Let's send it. Let's send it. Let's send it. And she said, I think, and she said two things. And in my writer brain, they were things I thought, well, that'll fly. That'll be okay. And she immediately pointed them out. And we really did work. And she's really brilliant. And we had a great, it was like when she would say something, I never said, oh, no, that's not right. I was like, oh, you're right. And so it was a beautiful process. And likewise with my editor, Elizabeth Schmitz, we had this incredible moment over Zoom. I studied creative writing under Seamus Heaney, and she studied poetry as literature under Seamus at around the same time. And she goes, editor, writer. And we had a similar, just a beautiful collaboration. So this process has been, really marvelous to have these two women who've been so, on side and with such a beautiful understanding of the book and what I'm trying to accomplish and helping it really get there.
So represented for other things. Let's talk about the other things. You have so many titles, and I don't know how you have the time. Filmmaker, playwright, producer, debut novelist. How do all of these things coexist, or do they not? If this is a building, are we talking open concept? Are we in separate rooms?
It's probably both, actually. So as Bart Mangrum knows, I did not set out to be a film producer. We had a film, and it became the independent darling, and this very famous studio was on board. And we had a group of producers who were, I think the euphemism in Hollywood is they were not the right fit, is what you say. And they were trying to push up the budget and get us to cast fancy actors, and we wanted to cast a young woman who actually uses a wheelchair, and they wanted us to cast an actress pretending to have a disability. In short, we were dropped. And all of a sudden, no one would pick up the phone. We were being called by everyone, and no one would answer the phone. It was this horrible thing. And our mutual friend, who is a cinematographer who was on it, and I were both in New York, and we went to a movie together, and he turned to me and he said, it's now or never, because we had a group of octogenarian Soviet emigres who are a choir, who we wanted to cast in the movie, and they were not getting younger, and they were having certain health issues. And I thought, oh my God, I have to produce this movie. So it was an absolute trial by fire. And it was very hard. And everybody who participated in it is as much part of it as anyone else, because it was so difficult. And it's a beautiful film. And it's called Give Me Liberty. And it's a real celebration of life. So that was a complete accident, the producing thing. So.
How do the processes compare? Because, writing a book, for such a long stretch of time, it is such a lonely act. It is just you, the page, at whatever hour. Whereas, filmmaking or theater, these are so collaborative. How do the two processes compare for you?
Well, theater, when you write your play, it's very alone, and then all of a sudden it isn't. It's very collaborative, and so that's really interesting. So I think I'd learned to go back and forth between them. But I was writing fiction. I was living in Brussels, commuting to Prague, working for Václav Havel, and helping him establish his nascent Czech government. I started working there the day the last Soviet tank left the city, and I was writing a play on a bet with two friends who were Irish actors who wanted me to write them a play, and I wrote them a play. And Havel was the playwright and philosopher who inspired the Velvet Revolution and went on to become the president of the Czech Republic. He was just, like, to me, he was the true philosopher king, and I kind of adored him. And so it was fitting to me that I was writing this play, but then my friends weren't cast, so it was a great introduction to theater politics.
So Brussels, I mean, you've lived there. I want to talk a little bit about the research behind this book, because I know some of it is like firsthand having lived there. But talk to me a little bit more about the research process behind this book.
Well, it was really interesting. I remembered something one of the ladies had said to me. She'd said we were all starving. And that at the time had surprised me because I hadn't thought particularly of Brussels in the context of World War II. It's not a story that's that well known that people talk about. And when I began doing the research a few years ago, I learned that the average Belgian lost 13 pounds in the first year of the occupation alone, which is, remarkable. And food was used as a weapon. It was weaponized, and there was a black market, and people were bribed, and it was a terrible, terrible time. But one thing I encountered, like I got this book, and I recently spoke to a Jewish Book Week in London, and I said, I got this book, and it had all these pictures that had been taken during the occupation, and it had been printed in the 1950s, and I was so excited to get it. And there was only one tiny, tiny mention of deportations or what had happened to the Jewish population. I was like, wow, that's shocking. So I think immediately after the war, everyone wanted to forget, even though the Belgians were in many instances incredibly heroic. And young women there had founded what's called the Comet Line, where they got many people out. They got a lot of British and American soldiers out, and these young women risked and in many cases lost their lives doing this. And they were like 19 to 25. I mean, it was just a remarkable thing. Belgium is a place that has had a lot of occupiers. The Romans, the Spanish, the French, the Germans again. They don't like occupiers. And when I first got there, I was sort of there a little bit in connection with the European community. So it took a while to kind of go native and really develop friendships and trust. And so there's this kind of like resistance. To me, it's no accident that surrealism comes out of Belgium, because it's like there's art and culture are like fundamental to the Belgian identity. But that being said, the research was tricky. I had to really look, I remember trying to figure out details, because details matter, like schools. Like what kinds of schools were kids going to in the 30s? And I was reading through these crazy Belgian pamphlets about the history of the school, talking about what the schools were going to be like in the 60s or 70s, and I'd find these little details. But, packaging, what kind of food you could buy, how much food you could buy, what things were open. Could you go to a cafe? What stores stayed open? Did the hat shops stay open? That was, it was hard to find. And I did a lot of work, archival research in libraries in Europe, too.
Yeah, we were having a conversation earlier about like, in historical fiction, you kind of have to figure out where your line is between like fixed details and malleable details.
Exactly.
Like a timeline of events, fixed details. Like you don't change when World War II began or ended. Like that is fixed in our knowledge. So it is always interesting to hear about like having to navigate like, even just for yourself, like how strict are you going to be with like, did that shop close?
Well, a great example is there is an art collection, and the paintings are described. There are several of the paintings that are described in the book. Each is a real painting by a very famous artist that was of unknown whereabouts during the war, plausibly in Belgium or France, lost at that time, and ended up in the museum in London. So, yeah.
Oh. Segues nicely to another question I have, which is, let's talk about art. Because we have, in this novel, we have an artist, we have an art dealer, we have an architect. I also have Masha, who's a seamstress, but I kind of group her with the artists as well.
I would, absolutely.
Yeah, so talk to me a little bit about the role of art in this book and what it means to you.
Well, it's interesting as I thought about it, and I always knew I'd write it. And the idea of writing it I've talked about this, became really urgent when I saw how polarized our world had become and how people had begun to hold these incredibly contradictory views and not entertain opposing views. And yet we all live in communities where our neighbors have those opposing views. So what happens when you're dependent on your neighbors for security or for food even, which was the case at 33 Place Brugmann during the occupation? Who do you trust? Who will you sacrifice for? Will you risk your life, the lives of your family? What matters to you? Who matters to you? And why does art matter? And that question became fundamental, and it ties into some philosophy that is also embedded in the book and is foundational to it, but this question of art and why we make art and why we care about art and what it says about us culturally, ideologically. Havel was of the view that art and aesthetics are the same. It's a view that, who said it first, who knows, Wittgenstein was of that view. And art does matter to these characters because it says something about who we are as humans, and why we make art says something about who we are as humans. So.
Yes, my confession is that I've only been to Brussels once, and it was for approximately 4 to 6 hours. I was taking a train from Amsterdam to Paris. I made a stop specifically just to go to the Museum of Fine Art and look at Bruegel's landscape with Icarus falling.
That is the best thing you could have said. Okay. I went to that museum every week with my son Max, who's the baby, who's now a writer and translator and plays music with Pussy Riot Siberia, and who worked with Bart on our movie. And yes, there's this incredible sort of heritage of art in Brussels. We used to joke that we could take people, like if they close their eyes between locations, they could think it was the most beautiful city in the world. People always think there was war damage. There wasn't much. It's just they tore things down and built very ugly concrete buildings between all the beautiful buildings. So.
But I was thinking about specifically that painting in the context of this book because, oh man, I'm failing my art historian brain of what year that painting was. But I was also thinking about the W.H. Auden poem about that painting, which was written between World War I and World War II. And this idea of, this painting taking on an entirely different meaning from how Auden looked at this painting, which for reference, this is the painting of Icarus falling. And it's people just going about their day, which feels very pertinent to this book.
Remarkably, I almost used an Auden quote in the preface. Yeah. I think so. I think that's very astute. Yeah.
Just in terms of when you are living in this building and you are faced with human suffering, with atrocity. Do you continue about your day? Do you stop? Do you look? Do you report? Do you gossip? All of these things feel so alive in this book.
Well, it's interesting because Havel had this idea that we are each responsible for all of us, and that society will only be strong if we each hold up our part. And he used this example, and I talked to Scott Simon. I had the great, lovely privilege of talking to Scott Simon the other day, and I described, Havel's idea was that if a shopkeeper puts up something in the window and it says, no women, no gays, no blacks, no Jews, if a person walks past it and does nothing, they're as responsible as the shopkeeper and as responsible as the mid-level bureaucrat who tells the shopkeeper to put that sign in the window, or the police officer who makes sure that the sign isn't vandalized, or the government official who says we're going to put up those signs. And it's a really high bar. And I always wonder, would I meet it? Do I meet it? When do we know that that's the standard for us, And yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about Charlotte, who is there are many painters in the novel and artists, but I think of her as the artist of the novel. Can you tell us a little bit more about her?
So Charlotte is colorblind, and she's truly colorblind. She sees in grayscale, and I had heard of someone who was colorblind and had an incredible sense of color, and it fascinated me. My mother's a painter, and I grew up with this, profound sense of color and, how to understand color and light and color. And so it was really intriguing to me, especially given the time, to think about someone who's doesn't see all those gradations. And Charlotte, I found her fascinating as I began to sort of write her, but she was also really difficult to write because I do think in terms of color. And so I didn't realize the degree to which I would, as a writer, you lean on color, like, oh, it's green. And I'm like, no, I'm writing in Charlotte's voice. I don't think of it that way. I can't think of it that way. But I think she does see the world differently, and she has a very particular take. She also, I don't know, Wittgenstein's philosophy is sort of part of this book. And Wittgenstein wrote this book called Tractatus, which really means tract. And Leo has a hard time with the title. He thinks it's pretentious and ridiculous. But there are people who love this book and who don't love this book. And the book did make quite a stir at the time he wrote it. And he wrote that book while he was in the trenches fighting in World War I. And it struck me that there's another book that was written in a similar time. It's Catcher in the Rye. Salinger was on a troop ship going to the D-Day, what would be, became the D-Day landing, and he found out that the love of his life, his fiancée, Una O'Neill, had just married Charlie Chaplin. And he was like devastated, volunteered for every awful, terrible mission in World War II. And the whole while, survived them, obviously, and for the whole time he was writing Catcher in the Rye. And I've always felt that's why that seemingly simple book is so universal, because all of that is somehow in it. I think Tractatus has that same thing, not a simple book. It is an effort through logic and deduction to come at truth that we can agree upon through facts and communication. And I find it really poignant that someone is using this brilliant math philosophy brain to try and find a way that people will be able to arrive at truths they can agree upon and communicate about. Like, how can we ever communicate is one of his utter preoccupations in that book. So Charlotte comes to it knowing really very little about philosophy and with very little regard for philosophy. And
which I appreciate about her, because I am that person.
Yes.
I was like, thank you, Charlotte, for walking me through this.
Yes, I thought that was a really fun way to approach it. But
talk to me about philosophy and the role of it in this book and with these characters, and how you introduce, what they're talking about, what they're thinking about. Like, what was the drive to put philosophy into this book?
Well, it was foundational because I was thinking so much about communication and about how we ever understand one another. And it's that whole notion of, if we can't communicate, if we stop talking, then all of a sudden we're in the realm of ideology. And that's very dangerous, right? And we have to keep talking. We have to keep communication and care and community. That's so critical. And I think in that time, it had begun to fall apart so terribly. It was such a devastating time for people. And I think a lot of people had these ideas about themselves, like, I believe in philosophy, or I'm religious, and all of that was challenged. You come to a terrible situation with a certain set of beliefs, and they're inevitably challenged. So.
Yeah, I mean, again, I just keep coming back to, like, Icarus falling from the sky. Like, when you see a boy fall from the sky, what do you do? Do you ignore it? Do you ignore
plow
the people
the
around
field?
you? Yeah.
I know. That's one of my favorite paintings, yes. It's amazing.
And this book, you've promoted it both here and abroad. How has that been, I guess, is my question.
Well, it's been very interesting because the question that comes up is, particularly from overseas, is this is so timely. And that's a pretty devastating, assessment, because one never wishes to write about one of the darkest times in history and have it feel so timely. And I think Europeans feel like everything is much more immediate right now because there's been a war at their doorstep. And I know, from Guy, the original concept of the European Union was to prevent another terrible war. you know, there's a lot of talk about, oh, it was economic, it was this, it was that. No, it was actually, there were two devastating wars that wiped out youth and hope and beauty, and how do we prevent that from happening? So I think Europeans are really nervous right now. Yeah, but the one thing they will say is the book gives them hope, and I'm like, oh, good, that's because I didn't write about a dark time. I wrote about these characters, and they happen to live in a dark time. So,
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that kept arising to me while reading this book was this idea of public courage. You know,
Yeah.
at what point do you not just privately like affirm your thoughts to yourself, but actually act on those thoughts in a way that makes you vulnerable, that is frightening, that has very severe consequences, which is just also like day-to-day existing right now. Like every day I keep thinking public courage, like what does it take? And at what point do you realize like I am very frightened to do this, but I will do so anyways? Anyways, I am getting the notion from Elise to turn it over to Q&A. So if you are good to turn it over to Q&A, and if people want to show some courage, let's get some questions.
You mentioned in Europe, you've been there with the book. How are you received?
well, I'm going there next week, so I will know.
Oh, I've been reminded that
yeah,
because we are
so-
being recorded, repeat the question back. Thank you, Elise. Sorry.
Sorry. Wait, so
Oh, repeat the question back real quick.
I'm so sorry. So how am I being received in Europe? So I've had interviews on Zoom, and they've been lovely. And I've talked to film colleagues who I'm seeing when I'm there, and they tell me, "We still love you, Alice." But it's going to be interesting because I am going to be in Brussels. In London, the book was, as here I was so thrilled to hear that it would be the March book for Parnassus. It's the book of the month at Hatchard, which is the oldest bookshop in London. And I think it's been very well received there. And my understanding is the Belgians are really thrilled with it. So, and the French, and it's being published in 9 languages throughout Europe and in Japan. So it's amazing. Yes.
What's your experience in writing screenplays?
So the question is, how different was it to create time and place in a fiction in a novel compared to screenplays and plays? So, so I started out as a fiction writer, and that's been my passion. And I think every one of my plays, critics will say that the place is a character. So I always, and I think that may be true of almost anything I write. I see place as a character. And then in terms of time, I'm obsessed with time. I have I started to study physics, and I have I keep up with reading, and I have an obsession with time and space. So that comes into play. I have one play. It was like my breakthrough play is backwards, actually. It's backwards chronologically, and it's scene by scene backwards, and actors tell me it's just so difficult to do because, they don't build, they have to kind of devolve. But so it's kind of similar. The difference, of course, is that you can really get into the inner thoughts of character. I mean, there's so many things. You describe, milieu, and you can, rather than in a play, you say almost nothing. And then you have to make sure you have a great set designer. So.
Senior in high school about to study theater in college, and it's very scary to do that in today's world.
Okay, the question is what advice I have for young artists, for a senior in high school who is looking to study theater. I think that's wonderful. I would say, and I guess you mean scary and just in terms of the world, also in terms of like professionally? Risk. It is risk. Yeah, it is. I understand. Well, I think you have to follow your heart. And I think so often we get this idea of what we should do, and we always know what we should do deep down. So if that's what your heart is telling you to do, you should follow it. There are so many opportunities for actors, for people in theater, and the theater community is a wonderful community. And the film community as well. There are these incredible artistic communities, and there are ways to make a living, and there are ways to sustain yourself. And I would say, go for it, and then reassess,
Curious about redemption in the novel. You have some characters who are unsavory, who have a couple of them, I'm thinking of them.
Well, I had certain ideas about some of the characters that didn't end up, it's like there's that great line in True Grit, where he's like, something goes completely wrong, and he's like, well, that didn't pan out. And it's, that kind of happened with a couple of my characters. And I loved it when they redeemed themselves. That was, to me, it's incredible when somebody does that. And it's partly opening yourself to the opportunity that someone can. I mean, I think that's part of the idea of communication. But there are a couple of characters, especially like non-first person characters who are truly unsavory, and there were true, I mean, it's really important not to be Pollyannish. There was evil, and there were people who did terrible things, and there were people who betrayed and killed, and it was a devastating time, and I didn't at all step away from that, which was hard to do.
How do you balance giving too much background of your characters with moving the plot along?
Well, I've had to learn to give a little more background because, in scripts you kind of tend to go from here and it's the here and now. So, I just tend to try to make sure that it's sort of organic to the story and fueling the story and giving enough but not too much. So it's always a dance. I keep not repeating the questions. Sorry.
How does empathy figure into the book? I assume it does.
The question is, how does empathy figure into the book? It definitely does, and I think empathy, in a way, is communication. It's listening. It's having understanding. It's trying to get in someone else's shoes, and I think there are characters who come to that slowly. There are characters who make a decision not to feel that way, and I think it was part of what was happening because, people were confronted with these very difficult decisions, and they were very personal decisions because they were all about life and death. So, Anne, did you have a question?
I actually have three.
Uh-oh.
Why a law degree? Why Milwaukee? And what's next?
Oh, these are amazing questions. So why a law degree? Why Milwaukee? And what's next? So I had these ideas about justice and writing, and I had a Fulbright to go to France, and I got into law school, and I was agonizing, and I wasn't going to go, and my advisor was a very wise man, and he said, you must go, and it was Harvard, and he was like, you must go, a sophistic education is invaluable. And it turned out to be really good advice because when I was in law school, there's this journalist, Anthony Lewis, and he taught this class on First Amendment, and I took it. And I also went over and worked in the creative writing department the whole time I was there. And Anthony wrote Louis Auchincloss on my behalf. And Louis Auchincloss wrote this letter, and he said, Dear Alice, never combine law and writing. It will work to the detriment of each. That being said, you won't have writer's block, which is true, because I had to do all these awful legal documents, and I did practice law, and so comparatively, writing scripts and writing a book is quite pleasurable. So Milwaukee was a really interesting choice. So we were in Chicago, and I was a Chicago playwright, and we were thinking of going back to Europe, and my mother-in-law, who lived in Sutton's Bay, I told Anne I read Tom Lake, and I couldn't believe it because I was Emily in one of those community productions of Our Town, and my husband grew up on a cherry farm in northern Michigan. I was like, what? So a beautiful, beautiful book. So my mother-in-law was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and we were not going to leave. We stayed, and at the time, my husband had these two offers. One was to go to Milwaukee, and one was to go to Switzerland. And we're joking. We're like, well, a bratwurst or an eclair. So we went to Milwaukee, and I love it. Actually, it's a city not unlike Nashville, and it's fantastic. It's really a community, and we've improbably made films there, and I've done plays there, and it's wonderful. I love it. And then what's next? So I have a couple of films in the works that we're trying to get financed, and hopefully we'll do that. One of them was a film originated by Alfonso Cuarón, and then the other one, I didn't know this, but the film that we made with Mr. Mangrum was Steven Soderbergh's favorite film of that year, and so he's on board to help produce this other one. But it's very difficult to make independent films. I was really, really grateful to our friend Sean, who just won all those Oscars, because he's such a true blue guy. He's really been in the trenches making films and gave such kind shout outs to independent filmmakers. And then I'm finishing a book that is set, I grew up in California, and it's set in the Great Vineyards in California. And it's a story of a family and a community, and it's during a very complicated time in the 1970s. So.
Can I make you recommend a book before we sign off?
Oh my goodness. Okay. So I did this, the first time I did this, my editors are like, well, you need to work on that. Because I was like, well.
Is it out of print?
Is it out? I know. They're like, it should be something people can buy and in English. And I was like, got it. I'll remember that. So I read Tom Lake, so I would recommend that. I read your wonderful book, Do Tell. I would also recommend that. I don't know how you nailed Hollywood and the world. Without the studio system, it's still the same, so brava. I read Rachel Kushner's book, not the new one, I haven't read that yet, The Flamethrowers, which is amazing. And recently, and this is in print, but I reread over winter War and Peace. And boy, is that a great book to read right now. And it is long. There's an incredible audiobook that is just wonderful that my husband did the audiobook on walks. But so those, I think those, and anything, I don't know, I have incredibly eclectic reading taste, and I've been a great Roberto Bolaño fan for a long, long time, and he was a writer who struggled for a long time, who had a long period of writing, and I came upon a poem of his that was very important to me, and he begins it by, also unpublished, by the way, the poem was unpublished, most of his great work was published posthumously. He describes himself as being like a snake in the North Pole, and then he lists all the publishing houses and editors and readers who've rejected him. And he says, he's sitting under a bridge in the rain, a golden opportunity, with my son writing with my son on my knee, writing until night falls, with the sound of 1,000 demons, the demons who will carry me to hell, but writing. So.
On that note.
I
think Alice has some housekeeping notes, but thank you so, so much, Alice.